My name is Roope Aaltonen. I'm an international trade advisor with UK Trade Investment in the southeast, cover Oxfordshire. I started my working life in market research, consumer analysis, feasibility studies, that sort of stuff, and it's a topic that has always been close to my heart, so I offered to talk about research. I'm going to briefly cover the following topics. First of all, why do research in the first place? I appreciate that I'm probably preaching to the choir, very small choir, but the choir nevertheless, in that you probably take it for granted that one should do research, but it's not always obvious. And in fact, I would say that in my role as an advisor, that's probably one of the most common mistakes that I see companies make, that they skip the research and planning phase and go straight into the action. So I'll say a couple of words about that. Then market selection, which is probably the most kind of fundamental types of research, in the sense that everything else flows out of your market selection. Then I'll say a couple of words about different types of research that you can do on a sort of DIY basis without it necessarily costing an arm and a leg. And then I'll list a few information sources, and finally I'll outline the UKTI market research offering and how you can make use of that. So I'm a big believer in market research, and I think that even a little bit of research is better than none, and the more you do, the better you understand your market, which really goes to the heart of what marketing is all about. And therefore I think it's very difficult to do marketing in new markets if you don't understand how the consumers behave, how the competition works, and so forth. So a few sort of fundamental truths about market research. I think there's a statistical technique called bootstrapping, which means that doing a little bit of research into a topic allows you to understand that topic better, and it allows you to come up with better questions to ask, and that way you kind of gradually get into that topic. So even, like I said, a little bit of research helps you to understand what the issues are. You can then start zeroing in those issues, and you will eventually get to where you need to go in a kind of step-by-step process. The other thing about research, I think, is that it's a process of constant and continuous improvement. So when you ask some simple questions, you get results back which allow you to ask better questions, and it becomes a sort of virtual circle in that sense. And I think also knowledge that comes out of market research is cumulative, in the sense that the more you know, the more useful the stuff that you knew before becomes, because you can put things into context. And finally, when I was, like I said, I started my working life in market analysis, and I still see it today, that companies are kind of a bit sort of scared of finding out that there is no market, or that the market is more difficult than they thought, more competitive, or there's less demand for your product or service. I actually think that those sort of negative findings can be the most useful ones, because it means that you don't then waste time and money chasing something that isn't actually there, so you can focus your efforts on a market that does exist. So in that sense, if you commission market research and the result comes back saying this market isn't really ready for your product or whatever, I think that's in many ways good news, rather than being a waste of money in any sense. The other thing that I sometimes hear companies saying is that market research is expensive, and we can't really afford it. We have a limited marketing budget, which I appreciate. Everybody does these days. But when you think what the alternative is, I think that is potentially far more expensive. So the worst case scenario, if you do research which turns out to be unnecessary, i.e. that the market isn't there or whatever, is that you wasted a bit of money on doing research. Whereas if you don't do the research and it turns out you should have, I think that can be potentially catastrophic, but it certainly can be far more expensive than doing a bit of quote unquote unnecessary research. but when I first started in market analysis, we developed products and concepts for large leisure retailing and hospitality and those sort of operators. And they were quite happy to throw 50 million at developing a new restaurant concept or whatever. And then we struggled to convince them to spend 50,000 on understanding what to build in the first place. And I always found that quite peculiar. In my opinion, the difference between just spending 100 units of money at market entry or developing a new product or whatever, I call that gambling. Because if you don't know that the market is there and you don't know how it operates and what consumers like and don't like and so forth, you're effectively gambling. Whereas with a little bit of extra cost, i.e. investing first upfront into market research, you can turn that gamble into an investment. And I would certainly myself be far happier investing 110 units into a well-researched, well-thought-through project than gambling 100 units of money on something that I have no idea whether it's going to work or not. Especially when I think in reality, actually, the two scenarios look more like this. So once you've done your market research and you understand how the market operates and what works and what doesn't and so forth, your actual cost of entering that market and operating in that market is likely to be that much lower. So I think you're actually saving money by investing a bit of money upfront into market research. So in that sense, research doesn't even become a net cost increase. It becomes net, or it can become. I'm not saying it always does, but it can become a net decrease in costs. So I'm going to now move to talk about a few different things that you can do just by way of kind of simple market research. But before I do that, I just wanted to say this, which is in the sort of true spirit of marketing, I think you need to keep an open mind in terms of how customers and resellers, channel partners, etc., as well as competition, but primarily customers, how they view your product and service offering, and really sort of try to think it through from their perspective. What is the value that you're bringing to the party? How does your product or service help them fulfill their needs and so forth? So rather than assuming that this is how my product works in the home market, and therefore it's going to work like that everywhere. I think it's kind of a good idea to approach that with an open mind, and almost I would say to build it from ground up for each new market that you're entering. And I can give you examples of products where our clients have gone into new markets and they've really struggled in the beginning to get any sort of traction, and then suddenly they kind of find a way into the market, and eventually they realize that the product does work in that market, but it just works on a completely different basis from the UK. So, and some of these things are really quite surprisingly common, like who are your competitors? If I had a pound every time I hear the answer nobody, I'd be a rich man. It is true that if you've invented something genuinely new and unique, there may not be a direct competitor for your product in a market, but there's most likely a way that people have found of doing that thing. They may be using a different type of product. They may be answering that need in a sort of indirect way. It may be that there is a product that exists, but it may not be as good as you. But if it does the job, then you're effectively against competition, whether you like it or not. And the other common one, of course, is who are the end users. Well, everybody, because my gadget is so brilliant that everybody should buy one. Well, everybody maybe should buy one, but that's not quite the same as who your target market is that you should be actively pursuing. So I just put up this slide just to kind of make that point that you really need to keep an open mind when approaching new markets, especially. So just to kind of the practical, a couple of practical examples of research. This was I just did this. I mean, this is sort of back of a cigarette packet type of stuff. I did this in maybe half an hour for one of my clients. They sell luxury travel goods and personal accessories. And I just pulled up some market data. You probably can't read it at the back, but it just basically lists the top 20 or so countries for that particular product category in the world, and it looks at it in two different ways. One is per capita sales, the bar chart, so how much per person each of these countries buys it relative to world average, and then the other one, the pie chart, is absolute market sizes in different countries. So, and it immediately brings up a couple of obvious ones, like Japan features very highly on both. Switzerland is relatively high on the absolute size of the market, and extremely high in terms of per capita expenditure and so forth. And it also shows that some markets that you might assume to be big buyers of, Louis Vuitton suitcases, etc., actually don't feature that well. So, for example, Russia, Korea, etc., are relatively low down. Now, it may, of course, be that Russian consumers go to buy their Louis Vuitton from Switzerland, which explains how both of those countries feature on these charts. But I think even that in itself is a useful observation. So, literally, with 10 minutes of pulling some charts together and 10 minutes conversation with my client, it became immediately obvious where they need to focus their efforts, at least in the short term. The thing is that nobody, even large companies with substantial resources, they can't really take on the whole world. It's just not possible to go into 192 countries, or however many there are, in one go successfully. And I think there is a risk that if you try to do that, you will end up diluting your effort so much that you end up going nowhere. So I usually advise my clients to try to narrow down the number of target markets that they are actively targeting to, I would say, less than 5. And if you can get it to less than 3, then I think it just shows that you've thought through how your product works and in which markets it can work that much better. And I would almost say that if one of your key target markets is one of the particularly difficult or big ones, like the USA, which in my opinion is probably the most challenging export market for most products, or China and Brazil and Japan, these are all quite tricky markets in many ways, then I would say your number of target markets should be that much smaller. And that's why this kind of market screening, market selection activity is I think particularly important. So just developing from the previous slide, this is kind of looking at markets on 2 dimensions, and I think this becomes quite interesting often. I mean, you'll recognize it. It's basically a Boston matrix. But the idea is that rather than just say where are the big markets and then go after them, you kind of qualify that the market size with some other criteria. That the other market criteria can be anything you choose, but in my example, I'm showing market accessibility as the other dimension. So I'm basically saying on the horizontal axis, market potential, i.e. basically the size of the market, and on the vertical axis, how easy it is for you to go after that market. So, and if you divided it into 4 quadrants, you can do it into nines or 16 or whatever. But I mean, this is the simplest and the most basic thing to do. So you immediately realize that there are markets that are small and difficult to access, which means there's no real point in going there, because you're going to spend a lot of time and effort, and there's little there. So I think you can pretty much sort of write those off. At the other end of the scale, there are large and easy to access markets, which would be the gold mines, except that I've yet to really come across one. there's kind of a sort of rule of thumb that size of market correlates with the difficulty of that market. So on a European scale, I would say Germany and France are probably the most difficult markets for many products and services to get into. On a global scale, you know, like I said, the Chinas and USAs and so forth of this world are difficult. So if you can find one of those gold mines, then you know, please, obviously, do go after it. But it may be that they don't really exist. So therefore, then the choices between the small and easy to access markets, what you might call sort of starter markets, which we would normally say for many, maybe even most products and services, the Nordics and the Benelux and Republic of Ireland and so forth are relatively easy markets to trade in for most products and services, and you could really start with those and fine tune your export operations and your offering and pick up some early wins, the sort of low hanging fruit, with which you can then invest into going after the more difficult markets, like the BRICS and the Mints and the USAs and those sort of places, where getting into that market successfully is always going to be a long-term proposition, and it's going to be expensive and it's going to be difficult and so forth. But whilst you have the sort of low-hanging fruit, the starter markets ticking over and generating export revenue for you, it's that much easier than to go after the big markets. So here's another example that I did for another one of my clients. This was done just within Europe, and taking the same approach as on the previous slide, but it's just breaking it into nine squares instead of 4. We looked at just the absolute market size, and then the intensity, so the relative size of that market. So this is for a product that solves a particular water-related problem at household level. So market size is just a number of households in the country, and the demand intensity is, like I said, the relative size of the market. So it's basically looking at how big a problem is this particular problem in those countries, i.e. how common is it for households to struggle with this issue, i.e. that they need to buy some sort of solution for it. And again, I did maybe half a day's desk research and found that data for all of these markets, and then it takes you literally 5 minutes to throw them onto that matrix, and you can immediately see which markets, i.e. the green box at the top, are the ones that you should go after, because they are both big and the prevalence of this particular issue is high there. And at the other end of the scale, Finland and Norway are relatively small markets, 5 million people each, and this problem doesn't really exist there, so there's absolutely no point in going there. And then picking up on the point from the previous slide, if you then factor into this a third dimension, if you like, which is the ease of accessing those markets. Like I said earlier, I believe that other things being equal, the bigger markets tend to be the more difficult ones, and I've marked them with a sort of amber kind of warning sign, and the green ones are the sort of the starter markets that are relatively easy to access, and the rest fall somewhere in between. And this particular client is now actively targeting, surprise, surprise, Austria and Switzerland. So they are kind of mid-sized markets. They are relatively easy to trade in, and this particular problem is really prevalent in those markets. So it's not rocket science, but sometimes it just helps you to kind of articulate these sort of issues. It helps you to get your head around it. It helps you to explain it to your board members or your distributors or whatever it might be. And I think in that sense, like I said at the beginning, a little bit of research goes a long way in making sure that even if it just confirms what you knew already, if you instinctively knew that Austria and Switzerland are the right markets to go to, then at least this confirms it in some sort of kind of quantifiable way. So, moving on to different types of research, you could do all sorts of research, and indeed arguably you should do all sorts of research over a period of time, but they all serve different purposes, and I think it's useful to perhaps clarify on that. So I think market screening and market selection, which is kind of what the previous few slides were about, I think that is quite sort of fundamental in the sense that it tells you which markets you go, which you should be targeting, and therefore everything else, any subsequent market research that you do, as well as other marketing and sales and business development activity, flows from that. So you need to get the market selection right, otherwise you're potentially wasting a lot of your effort. So assuming that you've gone through some sort of market screening exercise and you know which markets to target, I think the qualitative research is the next step, and this is probably the one which is most commonly overlooked. So this is kind of going back to the earlier slide about questioning your own assumptions and approaching the market with an open mind. So qualitative research basically tries to answer the question of what are the issues. So how do people use my product? How do people live their lives? So how does my product fit into their life and consumption patterns and so forth? So that you really understand where the consumer is coming from. And then you can move on to doing more quantitative research, which is then kind of testing the results of the qualitative research and moving from there to modeling and projections, so that you can start to say, well, now that I understand how my consumers view my product and how it fits into their consumption patterns, I can now start thinking about what the market size is likely to be and what sort of sales I could hope to generate from there and so forth. And then, of course, when you then do get established in the market, then there's all sorts of ongoing operational research that you can do, customer surveys and so forth. So very briefly, focus groups is a very good way of understanding the qualitative aspects of your consumers. Now, any market research agency out there will happily arrange a focus group or a series of focus groups for you, and it's likely to cost in the thousands of pounds to do just one or two, and if you want to do half a dozen, you're easily going to burn £10,000. You can do this actually yourself, because it's not really rocket science what they are doing. At the end of the day, what happens in a focus group situation is that you present your product, it's kind of a show and tell situation, and then you just got to step back and let people discuss it. So, and you just observe and you listen to what they if they say, yeah, I've used this product before and I wasn't quite happy with whatever, or I think this product solves a similar sort of thing as an existing product on the market, and you listen to the consumers, sort of compare and contrast, and you learn an awful lot. And I would say you learn so much that it's probably a good idea to record those sessions and play them back several times and get everybody involved in your management team to listen to the conversation, because it's a very good way of getting the consumer to convince everybody in your management team how the product works and doesn't work and what's good and bad about it and so forth. So you can easily do this yourself. It's basically just a case of finding half a dozen people, 10 people at most maybe, getting them into a room for an hour and listening to them discuss. Another technique is something that the market research agency is called Conjoint analysis. And what it's basically doing is it's forcing the customer to make some real life trade-offs. So instead of just, if you ask somebody, do you want a car with a more or less powerful engine, everybody's going to say more powerful, because there's no cost attached to that choice. So that in itself doesn't really tell you a lot. Whereas if you push them into a corner slightly and you ask them to make a choice which is meaningful to them. So do you want a car with a more powerful engine, but it costs more to buy, it costs more to run because of fuel consumption, emissions are higher, insurance is higher and so forth, or do you want a car with less powerful engine and lower cost of operation? Then they are faced with the same sort of choice as they do when they actually go and buy a car. And now you're starting to get more meaningful answers. The technique can be as complicated as you want, and it can be a learning process. So the market research agencies have software that effectively learns from previous answers, and it forces the consumer to make different sort of choices, and you eventually get to a point where you can rank how they value the different value drivers in your product. So the price and the power of the engine and environmental credentials and fuel consumption and all the rest of it, and you get to an actual ranking of this. That does get quite complicated, and that can be difficult to do on a DIY basis, but still I think the principle behind conjoint analysis is quite straightforward. Another technique is called it's a price point exercise called Van something or another Western dope analysis. It's again the rationale behind it is that if you ask a customer how much would you pay for this bottle of water, you get anything from 5p to £5, and it doesn't really tell you anything, because there are any number of reasons why a person would answer a question like that. That may necessarily have anything to do with the apparent value of that product. So what you ask instead is you ask a series of 4 questions, and you basically say, at what price point do you think that this product is so cheap that you would start to question its value? So you wouldn't really want to buy it anymore because you think that it's rubbish. And then you ask, at what price point would you say that this is a cheap product? And vice versa, at what price point is it an expensive product? So you start thinking this is actually a bit on the expensive side. And at what price point is it too expensive that you would no longer buy it? And when you ask this to enough many people, you can then plot their answers like that. And basically the area highlighted in pink is where your optimal price point sits, somewhere in that. It's typically either here or here, depending on what your market entry strategy is into that market. And this is generally regarded as a much more reliable and meaningful way of getting price feedback from potential customers than just asking the question, how much do you think this should cost? Okay, I will very briefly go through some sources of information that you can find if you're doing sort of DIY research. I think the slides are available later on, so you don't need to try to write this down. Our own website, UKTI.gov.uk, has a lot of information by country and by sector. Some of the international organizations like the World Bank and OECD, they have plenty of information, as does Eurostat, which is the EU statistical authority. Their website is well worth a look. I would just say one thing, that when you are on the internet doing research, you will come across all sorts of stuff, and some of it I think needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. So I don't know if Pizza Hut and FedEx are genuinely talking about setting up Pizza Fed, but I rather doubt that. I also don't think that Elvis runs a pub in Huddersfield, or that the world ended on the 21st of December 2012. So yeah, I mean, you will find everything and anything and everything on the internet, but it may or may not be necessarily true. Some of the libraries are, I think, very useful. So the British Library has a business information section. They have literally thousands of market reports available. Market reports from the likes of Euromonitor, Mintel and Gartner and so forth. So these guys publish reports on just about anything you can imagine, typically on an annual basis. So you can find the greeting cards in Europe 2013 market report, probably costs a couple of £1,000 or so forth. Or you can, like I said, you can go to the British Library and you may be able to access that same report free of charge. I think the trade itself, I think, is a good source of information. So trade shows, you can look at most trade shows put up the list of exhibitors on their website, and you can see previous year's lists and so forth. I think these are useful sources. And also, just picking up on the point about trade shows, seeing as we are at a trade show, trade shows in many sectors have become more of a marketing thing rather than sales. So 50 years ago, you would go to a trade show and you would expect to take orders on your stand, and that would become your order book for the year. That may or may not happen in many sectors. Like I said, trade shows are more of a marketing opportunity rather than an actual sales opportunity. But I think if you look at it as a marketing opportunity, and you look at it especially as a market research opportunity, then I think trade shows can be quite useful, because effectively you're talking to your target audience face to face. You hear it firsthand, what they have to say about your product and so forth. And I think approaching it as a structured market research activity can be, I think, very, very useful. I also put at the end those organizations, the World Association of Public Opinion Research and the American one and the European one. These are basically the sort of umbrella trade bodies for market research agencies and similar service providers around the world. So if you find that you need to do some consumer research in Indonesia or whatever it might be, then from these websites, you can find a local service provider who will be able to deliver those sort of projects for you. And lastly, very quickly, I'll just mention a couple of things that UKTI are doing to help you research overseas markets. So we have a service called Overseas Market Introduction Service, which is work done locally by our overseas network. So the commercial sections of British embassies and consulates around the world, their job is to help you as the UK exporter to get into that market in more or less whatever shape or form it takes. A large part of what the work that they do has to do with researching the market for one reason or another, and often it's with a view to finding a local partner, agent or distributor, etc. But it can be research in a more kind of conventional sense, i.e., what's the size and shape of the market, and how is it developing, and who are the big players, and what sort of price points do you see, and so forth. So this is a chargeable service, but it is highly subsidized. So you pay a small proportion of the cost because we don't do it obviously as a profit-making activity. I used this service myself in the past when I was a client of UKTI, and I can hand on heart, I can say that it provides excellent value for money. It's very cost-effective and also time-effective way of getting a handle on a new market, because our team are familiar with the country, they speak the local language, etc., and they can be doing work for you whilst you're focusing on other things. So it is a good way to approach a new market. We also have a service called Export Market Research Scheme, which is we don't do any of the research ourselves, we only provide funding for it. This can be for buying off-the-shelf market reports, like I mentioned earlier, the European greeting cards market 2013. You can use this funding to commission work from third parties like market research agencies or sector consultants of some sort, or indeed you can do the work yourself. So you might say, in order to understand the Southeast Asian market, I need to go out there with a colleague, spend a week or two on the ground, talk to potential partners, talk to maybe some government authorities if it's a regulated industry, talk to potential distributors, etc., maybe visit an event of some sort with a view to getting your head around how that market works and so forth. So as long as you can package it as an export market research activity, we can potentially provide funding for that. Most of our funding, if not indeed all our funding, is matched funding. So we pay, in this case, we pay up to 50% of the total cost. You need to pay the rest. And if you're doing the work yourself, you can't charge your own time, so you can't charge payroll costs, but you can charge out-of-pocket expenses. This particular scheme has an eligibility criteria in that you need to have at least 5 people on your payroll, and you need to have been trading for 2 years or more. That's probably a bit unusual in the sense that we are usually quite happy to talk to companies at a very early stage, but this particular funding has been aimed at, like I said, companies that have been trading for a couple of years already. So, and how you get access to these 2 schemes, OMIS and EMRS, or indeed for anything that UKTI offers, is if you haven't yet done so, I would very much encourage you to get in touch with your local advisor, like myself. There's something like, I don't know, maybe 300 of us dotted all around the country. We're all based locally to where the companies are. We don't all sit in some central office somewhere. And your local advisor will be able to, and will be happy to talk you through the UKTI offering in general, including our market research offering. And the best way to find your local ITAs is to either go and talk to my colleagues over at the desk, or if you go to our website, ukti.gov.uk, you can see all the regions, and it will show you the contact details of our regional team, or you can just type in your postcode and it will tell you where the local international trade team is based. So that's my talk. I think I've probably overrun already.